In the last episode of this series, I pointed out that while I've given you lots of information about the torso, I haven't really explained how you can put that information into action in an effective way. So let's begin to explore that now. It's a little bit of a puzzling question. How do we effectively change how we use our body? Many people imagine that strengthening exercises and stretches will improve your patterns of movement. But how will you engage in those exercises and stretches? Do you think you will magically coordinate the movements involved in those activities properly? If you are shortening your torso the entire time you are exercising or stretching, how will that lead to you being able to lengthen your torso? It won't. One of the primary ways we can begin to change how we use our body is using verbal directions. That might sound odd. What is so special about verbal directions? But really, there is nothing special about them. Verbal directions are simply how our reasoning mind is able to influence our actions. If we bring this back to what we were discussing not long ago about leaning with the torso, we can see how verbal directions can influence us. For instance, we had the direction for leaning forward, which was to move the upper sternum more quickly forward, and to slow down the lower sternum and lower ribs. For that direction to be useful, you have to have a certain basis of knowledge. You obviously need to know what specifically are the upper sternum and lower sternum. You also need to understand the broader framework, which is that we want the ribcage to rotate forward at the top and backward at the bottom, and that we want the ribcage to move up and not down when rotating. All of this was explained, and so you can come to a direction like, when leaning forward, move the upper sternum forward more quickly and slow down the lower sternum and lower ribs, and it will generally make sense to you. That set of directions is just a fragment. It does not contain all of the needed information. If someone had no other information, it's not hard to imagine that they would misinterpret the directions. But if you understand the overall gesture you're trying to make, and you understand the broader set of general instructions concerning the torso, then even this fragment of information, this small set of directions, can significantly change the way that you lean forward. But let's say you follow these directions while you lean forward, and you find that in order for you to get your upper sternum forward, you had to pull your ribcage a little bit down. Now you know this is not what we want. We want to keep the ribcage high above the pelvis. How can we deal with this problem? If we examine what typically happens in this situation, it's that the person has let their lower back round backwards. So let's define another point on the body. We will call it lumbar 3, because it's on the third lumbar vertebra. To find it exactly, just count to the third vertebra up from your sacrum. We can now create a new direction to help us improve how we're performing the gesture. The direction will be, I will pull lumbar 3 forward and up. So now the set of directions are to accelerate the upper sternum more quickly forward, slow down the lower sternum and lower ribs, and pull lumbar 3 forward and up. Pulling lumbar 3 forward and up would also tend to cause us to move the lower ribs and lower sternum forward. At first glance, that seems like a bad thing. This new direction seems to be contradicting the previous direction. But if you pull lumbar 3 forward while simultaneously pulling your lower sternum and lower ribs back, the opposing movements will generate an upward force that can lift your ribcage up away from your pelvis if you allow it to. Of course, as you add more directions, it becomes more difficult to remember all the directions and to orchestrate them together. But this is precisely the skill that you need to develop to improve your posture. And I assure you, you can learn to coordinate multiple movements fairly quickly. It's only difficult at first because it's something that most of us have never worked at before. This direction for lumbar 3 can also be applied while sitting. If you find you're slumped in a chair, it's pretty much assured that you have let your lumbar 3 go back. But if you just move your lumbar 3 forward and are not considering your lower sternum and lower ribs, you will end up arching your back, which is just as much a problem as slumping is. Jean Masseuero makes it very clear that individual movements are not sufficient to improve posture. When you're first starting out, you might work with a single direction just to gain an understanding in how to make such a movement. but it's actually through the simultaneous movements of multiple parts of the body that the appropriate tension and tautness in the structures of the body are achieved. So let's look at this in a practical sense. Let's say you just came home from a long workout and you sit down into a chair, and after a few moments you've found that you've gone into a habitual slump. What can you do? Most people might shift around in their chair a bit. Maybe they'll try to pull themselves up, which will likely be done by lifting the lower sternum and tilting back the top of the rib cage. But you have options. You can say to yourself, okay, I'm slumping. To undo that, I will lift my upper sternum forward and up. I will pull my lower sternum and lower ribs back and also up away from my iliacs. And I will pull my lumbar 3 forward and up. You can recall these directions, you can give yourself the directions through self-speech, and then you can put the directions into action simultaneously. This is the power of verbal directions. Verbal directions are how we remember a concept and then attempt to guide our implementation of that concept. Most people have no conception of what they want to do when they sit or lean forward. They just sit and they just lean forward. But when you have a conception of what is actually desirable, you can use verbal directions to guide your implementation of that conception. The directions that we can use and create are not limited. We can create new orders to deal with new problems. And as your posture improves, you will overcome problems and you will also come to new problems. The directions are not static things that you constantly repeat to yourself. They are a problem-solving tool that can be aimed at the wide variety of postural challenges that you encounter throughout your life. In the next episode, we will examine in more detail how we can implement a set of directions simultaneously. But I encourage you to try this out yourself. See what happens if you give yourself just the direction to pull your lower ribs and lower sternum backwards and up. Then try giving yourself just the direction to pull lumbar 3 forward and up. And finally, see what happens if you attempt to do both at once. Do you succeed, or does one movement win over the other? Join me next week, and we will explore how we can really start to effectively implement a set of directions.